Right, we're ready to go. Okay, everybody. Duncan Sandys. Well, we all know the story, don't we? This idiot comes along with this crazy idea that we don't need manned aircraft anymore. The RAF is going to be equipped with missiles. Nobody really believed this mad, crazy rocket man is right. The air staff are tearing their hair out in frustration at the idiocy of the idea. And of course, it's the end of the British aircraft industry. Fantastic aircraft like the Avro 730 supersonic bomber are gone. And the Saunders Roe 177, a rocket and jet-powered fighter, and that goes as well. And other more futuristic projects like the Vickers 559 go. And the fighter of the future, the one that the RAF decided it needed for the future, the Fairey F-155, that also gets cancelled. It's an absolute disaster. Well, that's probably what was going through your minds when you tuned in this evening, but let's find out what really happened. But before we do that, can we first check your homework? Please, gentlemen and ladies. You were asked to identify these fighters and what they were designed to do. Now, if we were in Kent Hill Community Centre right now, I get you screaming out the names of all these fighters. But, well, hey, what the heck, let's do that anyway. Frighten the living daylights out of everybody in your house. What's that one? Give it a shout, even if I can't hear you. Right, yeah, the Gauntlet, not the, who said Gladiator? No, it's the Gauntlet. And this one, Spitfire, that's right. This one, Hunter, that's right. And this one, Javelin. The Javelin, of course. Good, I heard someone actually shouted out. Brilliant, okay. And the more interesting question, what were they designed to do? Now, I was going to be ambitious this evening and actually get some answers from the audience, but perhaps I'll just take Chris's answer that he gave me the other night, because it was the perfect answer, absolutely right. He said they were all interceptors. And of course they were. They were all designed as bomber interceptors. They were all designed to take off, shoot down a bomber, land, and that was it. Now, of course, a lot of them proved to be capable of a lot more than that. The Gauntlet, for example, was a marvelous fighter, very, very maneuverable, very agile, capable of far more than just being a bomber interceptor, designed by Henry Foland, and anything he designed turned out very agile. Not famous mainly because we didn't happen to be fighting a war at the time. Spitfire, well, you know, what more can you say? Designed to shoot down bombers, but proved to be perfectly good at dogfighting with Messerschmitt 109s. Was used as a fighter bomber with the correct Merlin engines, turned into an excellent air superiority fighter, but it was designed just to shoot down bombers. Hawker Hunter, again, very versatile. Even the Americans liked the Hawker Hunter. And the Gloucester Javelin, well, you can't win them all. That didn't quite sort of live up to the standards of the others. But the important thing was that they were all designed to shoot down bombers, because that's what the Air Ministry wanted. That's what the British aircraft industry designed. Fighters that could shoot down bombers and bombers that could bomb enemy cities. So that's fighters to defend our cities, bombers to bomb enemy cities. In the 1920s, the enemy was France. So we built bombers that could bomb Paris. In the 30s and 40s, the enemy was Germany, so we built bombers that could bomb Berlin. In the 50s and 60s, the enemy was the Soviet Union, so we built bombers that could bomb Moscow. And that's basically what the aircraft industry designed. Long-range bombers and short-range interceptors. There were none of the sort of dogfighters of the First World War. They weren't designed like the Camel or Pup to do that sort of thing, although as we see here, some of them fortunately turned out to be capable of that. Okay, so how do we get into that situation? Well, let's just go back in history a bit. Let's go back to, well, before the RAF was formed, before even the Royal Flying Corps was formed, even before Trenchard knew how to fly a plane. Let's go back to 1909, the airship destroyer. a silent movie produced in Britain, supposed to be one of the, well, supposed to be the first science fiction films ever made about a future war. And in it, we'll see in a minute the first example of a ground-to-air guided missile. So let's have a look at this film. Here we are now. Then the problem, of course, was Zeppelins. That's what everybody was frightened about. And here's our aeronautical engineer with his love interest. They've just come back from a game of tennis. And oh gosh, yes, let's get married. Okay, but never mind about the tennis rackets. We'll pick them up later. Okay, and here's the old man. Good news, father. Father, I'm going to marry this aeronautical engineer. What? Aeronautical engineer? You are joking. No future in the business. Come here, come here. Oh dear. Right, but never, oops, careful, the bottle of wine, that nearly pushed production costs up. Distraught, he returns to his workshop. Very fed up, but if you look behind him, you will see the first ground-to-air guided missile, which is soon going to be needed because, come out here, have a look. What? Let me have a look. And here we have it. Airships. Of course, this is 1909. Zeppelins were the big fear at this time. And here we have the Germans launching bombs on Britain, doing it in a very military way. And here come the manned interceptors to shoot down the airships. And no, they don't work. And they have that sort of rather strange way of dying in those days, jumping up in the air. Okay, so the bombardment continues. And this is Dad's house getting destroyed here. But help is on the way. If you notice here, the guided missile has taken form. We've got a couple of wings, it's ready to go. But first of all, there's a bit of rescuing that needs doing. In he goes. And that's his future wife saved, I think. Yes, but no, the dad's in there. Well, gosh, back I go. So, not so fortunate, I fear. Never mind. Okay, off we go. At least we can get married now. Now, this is the interesting bit. And this is 1909, and already we have this image of what's going to happen to cities in future wars. And we're talking about the destruction of cities. Now, it's worth emphasizing that this is not just this particular film producer who's come up with this idea. This was a big thing in Britain at the time. People were frightened of the Zeppelins. There were people going around the country giving talks, describing how these Zeppelins were going to destroy cities. And this is something that's going to dominate British military thinking for the best part of the 20th century. It's interesting that Lord Northcliffe, who was a big supporter of aviation in the early years, he was actually thought that the country was coming a laughing stock because we were so worried about this possibility. It really was something that was being reported in the newspapers. People were seeing Zeppelins in the sky at night, all total imagination. Anyway, let's see what happens in this particular war. We've got our guided missile ready now. It's radio controlled here. This is no unguided missile. This is a guided missile. And off it goes. And does it work? Yes, I think so. There we go. The airship is destroyed. Okay. Let's oh well, happy ending, and they happily get married. Good. Okay, all right. So let's flash forward a quarter of a century now to the 30s, and we've got the same story. In 1936, H.G. Wells' Things to Come comes out as a film, and this is describing pretty much the same sort of thing, except this time Zeppelins aren't the problem, it's aircraft. Special effects are a bit better now. We've got these monstrous aircrafts coming to destroy cities.
Get out of the square. Get out of the street. Go home.
Now, this is the interesting thing. This is what is being predicted here. It's not so much the death and destruction of the bombing, but it's what's going to happen after the war, where basically we're bombed into the Stone Age. Here, there's no electricity. This is being worked manually. Here, you've got a car that's being pulled by a horse because there's no petrol.
There have been no cases for 2 months. The pestilence has been conquered.
And we're talking about the end of civilization as we know it. Stanley Baldwin, in his famous speech where he said the bomber would always get through, if you read on in that speech, he actually says that the next war in Europe is going to be the end of civilization. And this is what we're frightened will happen. This is dominating our thinking at the time. This is why all the Spitfires in the Second World War are held in Britain to stop this happening to the country. That's why there are no Spitfires in France in 1940, or in the Middle East, in the desert in 1941, or in Malaya in 1942, because they have to be held back in Britain to stop this happening. So again, I repeat, it's not just about death and destruction, it's about the end of civilization. If we flick forward 25 years, we get the same story yet again. The War Game was a program made for the BBC in the 1960s, describing a future nuclear war, which was so horrific, they didn't dare show it in the end. Let's have a look at an excerpt from it. Now, the danger now is not Zeppelins or aircraft, it's now ballistic missiles. And we're talking about hydrogen bombs.
12 seconds later, the shock front arrives.
And again, this is what's dominating thinking at the time. We're imagining war as being about destroying enemy cities, protecting our own cities. That's what it's all about. Okay, let's go back again and see where the pilotless aircraft fits into all this. So again, we're going back before the Royal Air Force is created. We're going back to 1916, and here you can see the first pilotless aircraft. The Royal Aircraft Factory, AT stood for Aerial Target. This was Henderson's idea. Henderson was in charge of the Royal Flying Corps at the time. And this was to prevent anybody suspecting what we really planned to use this for. This was going to be a guided weapon, radio controlled. The radio controls were developed by a chap called Archibald Montgomery Low, or Professor Archibald Montgomery Low, as he liked to call himself, although in fact apparently he wasn't a professor at all. The object of this was to hit air targets, Zeppelins, ground to air, and also ground to ground, hitting ground targets. It was going to be accompanied by another plane with the equipment to guide it. It would be guided into its target. They were even thinking of using TV. The word television was created, I think, in 1900, and even before the First World War, they had the first very, very primitive sets, which had a sort of could show a couple of frames a second or whatever, but the concept existed. And they envisage a future where these things would be guided from the ground by via a camera in the nose. This didn't have much success. I mean, there were 6 or 7 flights, I think. They never managed to control it properly. But this would become a big thing in the 1920s, especially with the development of automatic pilots. In 1914, Lawrence Sperry and his French collaborator, Émile Cachin, developed the first automatic pilot. Apparently, they demonstrated it by flying over a crowd, and they both climbed out of the aircraft onto the wing to prove that the aircraft was flying itself, which seemed a little bit dangerous. This gave another option for guiding the weapons, and this became a big thing in the 1920s. Really big. Trenchard was very keen on this idea of using pilotless aircraft to bomb cities. There were stories going around the Air Ministry about how some countries were ripping out everything from inside their aircraft that could possibly be used or required by aircrew and packing them full of explosives, and then either with radio control or just with an autopilot sending them in the direction of a city where they would cause devastation, destruction, whatever. Trenchard liked this in particular because of the random element. He appreciated that if you've got people in a bomber aiming their bombs, then you can always tell yourself that they're probably aiming at a military target, not at you. But if there's nobody in the plane, this then it becomes completely random. So, big thing in the 1920s, we actually started developing our own V1. Here's our 1920s cruise missile, RAE Larynx. 200 pounds of explosives, a range of 200 miles, which is enough to hit Paris from the south coast of England, and France was the enemy at the time. And this was trialled in the Bristol Channel. One of the flights, they didn't fill it out completely with fuel, they just half filled it, so only went about 100 miles. But it crashed into the sea as it was supposed to do. But unfortunately, there were some fishing boats around at the time that saw it crash, and they spent a long time trying to find the air crew, the pilot, and couldn't work out why the Royal Navy was trying to shoo them away. After that, decided the Bristol Channel was probably not the best place to test the vehicle, so they went off to Iraq, and all the future tests took place in Iraq. And by the end of the 20s, they were pretty satisfied with it. They thought there was a reasonable chance of it hitting something as big as Paris from 200 miles, and they felt it could be ordered into production. But then there was a change of policy. Trenchard had gone, indiscriminate bombing was out, and precision bombing was in, and the Larynx was far too inaccurate for that. Now, the Air Ministry may not have been interested in indiscriminate bombing, but that didn't mean that other nations weren't. There was, in fact, a great deal of concern in the 1930s about the threat pilotless missiles posed. Henry Tizard's committee is famous for kickstarting the development of radar. But if you look at the minutes of meetings, radar is hardly ever mentioned. There were occasional reports on the progress being made, but everything seemed to be coming along nicely. They spent far more time discussing the threat posed by pilotless missiles. Tizard thought the country should at least develop a prototype, a super larynx as he called it, that would be available if retaliation was required. It could perhaps even be put into production and stockpiled. The Air Ministry weren't the least bit interested in this idea. They didn't do indiscriminate bombing anymore. If anyone was going to dirty their hands with such tactics, it would have to be the army. Now, the person in charge of missile development for the War Office was Alwyn Crowe, and he had indeed come up with some interesting ideas. These included cruise missiles powered by rockets, jets, or both, and even a multi-stage ballistic missile that would rise 500 miles into space before descending on enemy targets 500 to 600 miles away. These were all very speculative, back-of-the-envelope ideas, and there was no attempt to develop the hardware. Nevertheless, there was no shortage of ideas on how indiscriminate attacks could be delivered. Now, in the Second World War, it soon became clear that precision bombing wasn't working. The Butt report in 1941 made it clear that not only were the bomber crews not hitting their targets, they weren't even finding the cities the targets were in. Precision bombing was abandoned and replaced by indiscriminate area bombing, with new navigational aids developed by the TRE helping the bomber crews find their targets. Now, around this time, there was an interesting exchange of memos between Crowe and Jimmy Rowe, the boss at the TRE. It seemed to both of them that if the aim was simply to hit city centres, there was no need to risk air crews. It could be done by the sort of pilotless missiles Crowe had in mind. Jimmy Rowe came up with the idea that they could use jet engines, using jet engines which could be more or less made out of bashed tin and very cheaply, as he put it. I'm not sure what Rolls-Royce would make of that. But the TRE had created these navigational devices which were helping Bomber Command with like G and oboe, and there's no reason why these couldn't be used by unmanned vehicles. Now, this didn't get very far at the time. Tizard, in fact, was against the idea, and you can understand why. We were gone down the path of the manned bomber approach. The production lines were set up. We were training the air crews, and it was too late to go back to switch horses midstream. A few years or a year or so later, though, of course, we do start getting bombarded by cruise missiles. V1s. The cruise missile comes as no surprise to us because we've been developing that sort of technology. The ballistic missile was a bit more difficult to believe, although the Army had been talking about multi-stage rockets in the 1930s. Harris, of course, was somebody who immediately saw that this was precisely the sort of weapon he'd like to have under his control for his area bombing program. It's interesting, actually, how much destruction they thought these weapons could cause. There was this theory that could actually postpone the invasion. The death tolls that they were predicting were like the death tolls they were predicting before the Second World War. Huge casualty lists. In fact, it's difficult to imagine weapons this inaccurate actually doing as much damage as Harris was suggesting. He just didn't see how an invasion could be possible if the southeast of England was wiped out by these weapons. But he accused the Germans of making the elementary mistake of fighting this war with the weapon of the next war. But interestingly, he was talking about these being the weapons of the next war. This was already fairly established that this was how future wars would be fought. Okay, let's just cut back a bit and look at the defensive use of pilotless weapons. This, of course, was what one of the roles that the original pilotless weapon in 1916 was supposed to be capable of. A lot of research in the 20s and 30s went into investigating homing devices. A lot of this stuff doesn't get recorded because it didn't actually get anywhere. So it doesn't really deserve much space in history books. But there was a lot of research into, as rather quaintly put by a document in 1933, where final guidance is unwittingly given by the target. And they investigated just about every possible way of homing in on an aeroplane, anything it emitted, homing in on sound, electromagnetic waves, any wavelength, including infrared. But not much progress was made. One system that was suggested was the RAM interceptor. This would be a pilotless aircraft which would be accompanied by two shepherds, which would guide the aircraft, the interceptor packed with explosives, into the center of the bomber formation, where it would be detonated and destroy the formation of bombers. This didn't get very far either. They did some research and decided that actually bombers don't actually fly that close together, and it probably wouldn't do that much damage. And also it's a very complicated system. You're using 3 aircraft, one of which you are definitely going to lose. But the idea is there that you can use a pilotless interceptor. And just going forward a few years, just to after the Battle of Britain, interestingly, Dowding, after the Battle of Britain, he was attending a conference where they were discussing the form that future air defence systems should take. And of course, the heroes of the Battle of Britain were the pilots. But interestingly, Dowding considered them to be the weak link in the chain. He would like to see the day when the entire process was automatic. Now, in 1940, we had centrometric radar for the first time, which means we've got the wavelength down to a point where you can actually direct it at an object, and you can start to consider lock and follow procedures. So the idea was that it would lock onto a bomber, record its speed, altitude, everything else. That information then would be passed to a fighter, the autopilot of a fighter. You'd still need a man to take off, but once it was in the air, then the entire process would be automatic. The aircraft would be guided to a firing position by the autopilot. Radar would then decide when it was within range, and then it would shoot down the bomber. This, for anybody interested in radar, is the beginnings of AI Mark 9, which we're actually still trying to get to work properly in the 1950s. But again, the idea is there that if possible, we could remove the man from the equation and have an automatic process. Now, all this is working because we're only thinking about shooting down bombers which fly straight and level, and we're not too worried about escorts or anything like that. Okay, so then we have the atomic bomb at the end of the Second World War, and this is very important, not because it changes the way wars are going to be fought, but because it changes the way we think wars are going to be fought. The atom bomb wiped out everything we'd learned in the Second World War. We were actually moving away from this idea of wars are all about bombing enemy cities and defending our cities, and that's how it's going to be decided. We were developing a mechanized army, we were developing close air support. In 1942, we even released a specification for an air superiority fighter, F-642. This was going to be a fighter where its performance did not depend on the enemy bomber, it depended on what the enemy fighter could do. It was a fighter that could dogfight and not just go up, fly fast in a straight line and shoot down bombers. And if you want to discover more about that specification and why it was not followed up, then you can buy my book, which comes out next month. I just thought I'd get a quick plug in there. But anyway, since we got to the atom bomb, shall we take this opportunity for a brief break, and then after the break we'll have a look at how this developed after the Second World War. Okay, so we've got to the end of the Second World War, and as I say, the atomic bomb has the effect of just wiping out everything we've learned during the Second World War, because now it's well, there's not going to be any of these armies anymore. It's all going to be nuclear weapons. So in fact, in many ways, it's Groundhog Day in the 50s and 60s. We're just going to repeat what happened in the 20s and 30s. All right, this is what the air staff were discussing in 1945, immediately after the Second World War. It is assumed that aircraft of the future will be pilotless. The only, it's a rather quaint expression, the only inhabited planes, they put it, will be anti-submarine, transport, and tactical reconnaissance. And every other sort of plane would be uninhabited. And they released specifications in 1945 to produce the aircraft of the future, which will be pilotless. So OR-202, released in 1945, wants a surface-to-air guided weapon, SAGW, or SAGWA, and range 30 miles, supersonic. And this comes out in September 1945. Slezzer, who becomes the Chief of Air Staff in 1950, is quite clear about what the future is. And we all hope that we will be able to dispense with the majority of manned fighters. So even in 1950, they really are heading towards a future where we haven't got any manned fighters. The parallel specification released in 1945 required a long-range expendable bomber, 10,000-pound payload, that's about the weight of the early atomic bombs, range 1,500 miles, that's going to enable you to hit Moscow, and again supersonic. And again, Sreza is quite clear about this in 1950. In the view of the air staff, the ultimate answer to this requirement is some form of pilotless bomber. Now, you have to emphasize here that really they've got this sort of tunnel vision of future war, which is just going to be completely atomic. There's going to be no armies or navies. They're just a waste of time. And in that sort of context, they are actually right. It probably is the best way of delivering those sort of weapons. Okay, so there are problems with the expendable bomber. After the war, they were very much thinking about pilotless aircraft. And this actually wasn't terribly practical because guidance systems just couldn't guide an aircraft, an unmanned aircraft that far. Inertial guidance systems degrade with time, so the shorter the powered flight was, the more accurate they were going to be. De Havilland did a very interesting paper early in the 1950s where they said it's got to be a ballistic missile. It's the only way you're going to be able to have any chance of hitting a target. The problem with the ballistic missiles is that we just didn't have any rocket engines in this country. Our most powerful rocket in the early 1950s was still the Spectre, which produced about 8,000 pounds thrust, which was ridiculous compared to a V2, which had about 60,000 pounds thrust. Rolls-Royce came up with a proposal in the early 50s for developing a ballistic missile, which is pretty much the same sort of system that the early Soviet missiles used. They didn't have particularly powerful rockets, so they just put lots of them there. This is the rocket that actually launched Gagarin, had, what is it, 4 times 520 rockets. Rolls-Royce were actually suggesting 33 of these 8,000 pound thrust rockets for a first stage. But then the Americans came to our rescue. They were developing far more sophisticated rockets than we were. The S3D, which powered the Thor and Jupiter missiles, had a thrust of 135,000 pounds. That's about twice as much as the V2. So the Americans very kindly gave us their rocket. They also gave us their guidance system, inertial guidance system, and we wrapped a fuselage around it and called it British, the Blue Streak. This was the ultimate goal then. So now the air staff are only interested in this as the method of delivering the atomic and hydrogen bombs of the future. It was still somewhere in the future, though, so there had to be steps leading up to this. This wasn't going to be available until the mid-1960s at the earliest. So the V-bomber program was established immediately after the Second World War. This was going to be the first step. But even that was not going to be good enough to take us up to the introduction of Blue Streak. So an intermediate stage was introduced with the Avro 730 supersonic bomber. And it was the same sort of story with ground-to-air systems. The ultimate aim was SAGW, the SAGWA. This is what would be our ultimate defense system. But it was going to be some time before we developed that. So as an intermediate stage, we developed the Glossy Javelin. The Lightning was another intermediate stage that took us supersonic, described in Parliament as a ground-to-air missile with a pilot aboard. It was a sort of reusable ground-to-air missile in a way. And then we move on to the rocket-powered fighters. This was rocket and jet powered, the P-177, and the ultimate fighter, the Fairey Delta III, which was being built to OR 329. Interestingly, in the early versions of the spec for OR329, the introduction quite clearly says this is going to be the last manned fighter for the RAF. So the Air Ministry and the Air Staff are already thinking along these lines. Okay, let's just have a closer look at the ground-to-air missile system. This was the Stage 1 weapon, which was basically what the 1945 specification was all about, which would eventually lead to the Bloodhound Mark I with a range of 20 miles. By the mid-50s, it was recognised that this was going to be pretty useless, really, because by that time the hydrogen bomb had come along. And if you shoot down a supersonic bomber carrying a hydrogen bomb 20 miles away, then the momentum is going to carry that weapon close enough to its target anyway to destroy it. So they realised that this was really not going to be a very useful system. The aim was eventually to lead to the Stage 2, the green sparkler system, which would have a range of 200 miles. That was a big step forward as well. So they introduced the intermediate stage of Blue Envoy, which would have a range of 150 miles. Now, this is important because Blue Envoy was the first system that we had which we actually believed in, we thought was actually going to work. At a very early stage, the Bristol Bloodhound Mark I was very much just a training vehicle that would get ground crews used to the idea of using missiles, etc. Okay, so in the 1950s, the early 1950s, the Air Staff, the Air Ministry are working towards unmanned systems. And there's a bit of controversy. There's concern in the Air Ministry about the way this is going. There's a nice little note from the Earl of Brandon, who's responsible for training. He writes his memos, he includes the line, at present I'm responsible for aircrew training. But when they cease to be aircrew, who do I train? And people are getting a bit worried about this. Where's this Air Force going? You know, if we've got no pilots. He gets this nice encouraging reply back, which says, don't worry, you know, we're going to need air crews for many years to come. But interesting thing, this is 1954, and he's not saying we're always going to need air crews. He's saying we're going to need air crews for many years to come. And the Earl of Brandon is, you know, trying to sort of reassure everybody in a way, basically saying that just because we haven't got pilots inside our aircraft doesn't mean we're not going to have air warfare. Air warfare is not going to be extinguished when air crew are no longer required, but he's clearly talking about a time when there are no air crew. And some actually saw a big advantage in this. You know, a lot of parents don't like their kids going off and joining the Air Force with those noisy, dangerous jets where they might get killed. So the idea that they'd all be sitting on the ground just controlling missiles actually might encourage recruitment for the RAF. But the thing here is that it's quite clear that they're all planning for the day when we have no more pilots. And again, this is purely because of this tunnel vision view of air forces being used to defend cities, bomb enemy cities. That's what air forces do. Okay, this was a bit of a problem for the air staff now. They're into these SAGWA things, these surface-to-air guided weapons, but is that what an air force is all about? And somebody pointed out this perpetuates the conception that these weapons are guns rather than aircraft. This is no good, you know. We're kind of an air force that has guns. We've got to be an air force that has aircraft. So he suggests this SAGWA business is not a very good name. Nobody can pronounce it. Why don't we have something a bit more pronounceable? So he comes up with SAPA, surface-to-air pilotless aircraft. Or an alternative suggestion is the SAGA, surface-to-air guided aircraft. But you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to get the word aircraft back into it so that we've still got a justification for an air force. And I think it's cartoon in a way sums up the feelings, the attitudes at the time.
The Air Ministry were quite resigned to having an air force with no pilots. The only question was, when would this happen? Some thought it might be as early as the 1960s. Others thought it might be the 1980s before manned aircraft disappeared.
Okay, then Harold Macmillan arrives on the scene. Now, Harold Macmillan, he was very briefly Minister of Defence before he moved to the Treasury, but he was in the Ministry of Defence for long enough to get some idea of what was going on in the military world and how our armed forces were developing. In the Ministry of Defence, of course, he was trying to get funding for our defences. Once he moved to the Treasury, he was trying to reduce funding for our defences. And this is before he becomes Prime Minister, and he's very anxious to reduce defence funding. So he's looking for areas where he can reduce spending. And in 1956, while he's still at the Treasury, he leaks a paper to test the water. And in this paper, he makes these assumptions. Fighters will not be effective against ballistic missiles. It's sort of fairly obvious in a way. If the enemy's going to have ballistic missiles, what's the point of having fighters? They can't possibly shoot them down. Fighter cannot achieve its purpose in a global war. And of course, remember, we're all transfixed at the time by this idea that the next war is going to be this sort of nuclear holocaust. And that's the only thing that anybody's thinking about. So it can't do anything in a global war, but fighter command has no part to play in any other type of war, a more conventional war. And 1956, remember, this is a time when the Suez crisis is beginning to brew up. So we are beginning to think about how we might need to use our armed forces in a more conventional war. And he comes to the conclusion or the question, is it not sensible, the difficult decision for Her Majesty's government to abolish fighter command? And what's fighter command doing? In a Suez type situation, fighter command doesn't really help us, nor do the sort of aircraft we're designing for fighter command, these very short range rocket powered interceptors. They're not going to be any good if we have to act in the Mediterranean. And to emphasize this, he's not talking about manned aircraft or anything like that. He's talking about fighter command. Fighter command is going to cost the country, he estimates, 1,000 million over the next 10 years. That's £1 billion. And he doesn't see the point of having it. So he decides that or proposes Javelin and the Hunter will be the last fighters for fighter command. And SAGWA needs review. And the Air Ministry took that word review to mean SAGWA goes. We lose the missiles, the ground-to-air missiles as well. And he comes up with a statement which is rather interesting, actually. If there is an agreed requirement in the RAF, overseas, or in the Navy, then perhaps we could buy one of these. We could buy the Lightning, the P177, or the Fairy Delta III. But you've got to come up with a reason why we need to buy it. The Navy did come up with a reason. They said that their fleet needed fighter protection, and at the time, ground-to-air missiles were far too big to go on most naval ships. The Sea Slug was the equivalent, naval equivalent of the Bloodhound, and most ships couldn't carry it. They needed aircraft carriers to provide defence. The RAF are a bit annoyed about this because a lot of people were very sympathetic towards the Navy. Yes, you made a good case there. You do need a fighter. And the RAF was saying, yeah, come on, how come they can have fighters if we can't? But I'm sorry, you know, the RAF hasn't made a good case. And another interesting statement, he goes on to say, or perhaps some aircraft not now in the programme at all. So what Macmillan is saying to the Air Ministry is, you know, come up with an aircraft we can actually use. Stop banging on about short-range interceptors and long-range bombers. We don't need them anymore. You can't shoot down ballistic missiles, and we've got better ways of destroying Moscow. And basically, the air staff agree with this. What really annoys them is that the government is deciding that these aircraft should be abolished. Basically, they agree with the thinking behind it. This is the 1957, the Operation Requirements Department in the Air Ministry. Whenever an operational problem can be precisely defined, an unmanned system is likely to be best. If your aim is to destroy a city, You don't need a manned aircraft. You don't need to make decisions. Yes, if you're attacking a road and there's a convoy on it, and you have to make decisions about whether that convoy is military or whether they're refugees or whether you should attack. Yes, in those situations, you need the initiative of a pilot. But if you're just trying to destroy Moscow, then you don't need to make any decisions like that. Again, this is the Operation Requirements Department. The manned bomber is dead as a concept against Russia, which is absolutely true. You've got ballistic missiles are going to be doing that in future. Again, operational requirements. The contribution which future manned fighters can make is insufficient to warrant their development. Again, this is through this tunnel vision view of warfare being all about destroying cities and defending British cities. And in that sort of context, this is true. So, what's the situation? Well, when he becomes Prime Minister, he appoints Duncan Sandys as Minister of Defence, and the cuts come. The Ferry Delta 3 goes, scrapped. The Saunders 177 goes. English Electric Lightning remains, basically because it was so close to going to service anyway, they weren't going to make any savings by scrapping it. But this is the interesting thing. Green Sparkler, the Stage 2 ground-to-air missile, goes. Blue Envoy, now remember, this is the first one that's going to be usable. Bristol Bloodhound Mark I is really only for training, but that goes as well. And a lot of people, when they're looking at the 1957 white paper, are a bit confused about this because the general perception is that it's all about replacing manned aircraft with missiles, in which case, why are we scrapping Blue Envoy? But the key thing here is that we're not scrapping manned aircraft, but Miller wants to get rid of fighter command because he sees no purpose for it. The Bristol Bloodhound Mark I stays for the same reason the Lightning. It's so close to going into service. There's nothing to be gained by actually scrapping it. But as we all know, the Bristol Bloodhound Mark I doesn't actually work very well. It's not going to be very effective. But it does look good. It is impressive. And we can't really tell the public that we're not going to defend them at all. But if you have lots of these around, it looks good. And of course, he's chosen his cabinet very carefully. He's chosen Duncan Sandys to be the person who will present this case in Parliament. And he believes in missiles. He is a rocket man. He thinks they're the future. So he has no trouble actually going along with this idea. So even though these missiles aren't going to work, as one person in the Air Ministry commented at the time, but the Russians won't know that, even though we know these missiles aren't going to work, they look good, they're impressive, and in Parliament, Duncan Sandys is the one who stands up and says, a manned fighter force smaller than one at present will therefore be maintained. This will later be replaced by ground-to-air guided missiles. And he believes this because that's, he is a great believer in guided missile systems. Okay, so what about these aircraft that are scrapped? Well, the Avro 730, I mean, what's the point? A supersonic bomber that's going to drop a hydrogen bomb on Moscow. We're not going to need it. You're not going to get any export sales. Nobody's going to be interested in buying it. Export sales are a very good way of judging how useful a plane is in an actual war, as opposed to how useful it might be in peacetime as a political tool. Aircraft like the Hawker Hunter, there was an export market for them because people liked the plane. The Javelin didn't get exported because nobody thought it was any good. And, the Vulcans were brilliant pieces of engineering, but there was no export market for aircraft like that. The rocket-powered interceptors. What point is there in having a rocket-powered interceptor with a rocket engine which only gives you thrust for 7 minutes? Okay, if you're trying to defend London, maybe, but it has no range. It's no good in a situation like the Suez crisis. And the same was true of the other projects at the time. So what we're having is a clear out of aircraft that aren't actually much good. These are the sort of military Concords of their time. Wonderful pieces of engineering and nice to look at, but not actually very useful if you're actually fighting a war. Okay, so where does that lead us? Well, it wasn't just the 1957 review that was determining the future shape of the RAF. The Suez Crisis as well had an effect, because the RAF actually struggled in that. Got a bit embarrassing because the French Air Force had F-84 Thunderstreak fighter bombers, and they had pretty good range. We were struggling along with fighter bombers like the Venom, which were very limited range. The only way they could operate over Egypt was to fly at cruising speed. They couldn't fly maximum speed because it would reduce their range. And a report on the fighting, an air ministry report after the Suez campaign, said if there'd been any serious opposition, we would have been in trouble.
We need fighter bombers with greater range.
This was the RAF's problem at the time. They had these short-range interceptors with no range and these huge V bombers with immense range, with nothing in between. So there was some sort of motivation already to actually change the shape of the RAF. And aircraft around at the time, like the TSR-2, seemed to fit the bill. The TSR-2 had actually been around as a proposal since 1951. This was supposed to replace the Canberra, but it was looked at, shelved throughout the 1950s. We weren't particularly interested in tactical air support. After the Suez Crisis, we began to show a bit more interest in it, but even in its original form, this had a radius of action of 1,000 nautical miles. And that's nautical miles, so actually about 1,150 miles, which is pretty large for a tactical support aircraft. In fact, the Air Ministry said, oh, hang on a second, 1,150 miles, that's not so far short of 1,500 miles. We put a little bit more fuel in it, then we can bomb Moscow. It was very difficult to get the air staff, the Air Ministry, off this idea of having bombers that could bomb other cities. And costs got pushed up. It was expensive. Nobody wanted to buy it. Nobody wants to buy a plane with that sort of range and that sort of capability. So in the export market, it was going to be no good. And basically, it was the Avro 730 supersonic bomber in disguise. Another aircraft around at the time, the Hawker Cam was proposing his vertical takeoff catch-all, which would become the Harrier. In 1957, the Air Ministry thought that was absolute rubbish. Who would want a plane that would only fly a couple of hundred miles? Early development was actually sponsored by the Americans. In 1959, we started getting a little bit worried because we began to think maybe perhaps it's quite useful after all. We don't want this thing sort of being taken over by the Americans. And again, with a tactical air force in mind, this was going to be something that would be useful. But things didn't really change until 1962, when the Navy took over responsibility for the nuclear deterrent with Polaris. And this was a game changer for the RAF. The RAF had been created to develop a long-range bomber capability. That was the raison d'etre of the RAF. In reality, it was really a millstone around the neck of the RAF. They've been lugging this through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. They couldn't really develop a mobile, effective air force because they were just obsessed with this long-range bomber requirement. Once that had gone, once they got the deterrent out of the way and the Navy was dealing with that, then the RAF, the air staff, the Air Ministry began to think along more positive lines. And it has to be said that they were encouraged to a certain extent by the need to cooperate with Europeans who had a better idea of what was required in a future war. So you had projects coming along like the Jaguar and later the Tornado, which weren't bombers that were going to bomb Moscow. The fighter situation is quite interesting because immediately after the Duncan Sandys 1957 white paper, there was already talk in the Air Ministry of a Lightning replacement, a replacement for the Lightning fighter, but not a short-range interceptor. Initially, again, this was very much with the Suez crisis in mind, where hunters didn't have the range to be effective. So they realized that they needed something that could go a bit further. And also just in the home defense scenario, they realized they needed something with more range. One great disadvantage of ground-to-air missiles is that once you've launched it, you can't bring it back. And it's interesting that the air staff only began to think about some of these advantages rather late in the day. You don't always necessarily want to shoot something down. You want to go up and investigate what it is. There have been enough tragedies where ground-to-air missiles have been used against civil airliners. This idea of a long-range interceptor began to evolve. Still an interceptor, though. They still weren't thinking about World War I style dogfighting aircraft. But then in Vietnam, the MiGs were running rings around the Phantoms. And this idea of an agile fighter began to emerge. And that, of course, would eventually lead to the Typhoon. So we're getting a much more flexible Air Force. Really, the Duncan Sandys white paper just got rid of all the dead wood, all the stuff that wasn't really going to be very useful.
Nor was it all wasted effort. Bloodhound Mark I re-emerged as Bloodhound Mark II, a much more useful anti-aircraft missile, which used a lot of the technology that they were planning to use in the Blue Envoy system.
So, Duncan Sandys. Well, I think he was the fool guy, really. He took the flak for all this. The air staff realised that they got it wrong. In the 1950s, they were in favour of getting rid of manned aircraft purely because they were thinking about this nuclear war scenario. Clearly, with hindsight, they got that wrong, but no reason why they should accept responsibility after it was Duncan Sandys who stood up in Parliament and said those things. So there was a tendency to blame him for all that happened. So I think probably history's been a little bit unkind to Duncan Sandys. The ideas that he and Macmillan were coming up with were pretty much the ideas that the air staff had at the time. The air staff just felt they were being pushed a bit faster than they wanted to go, and perhaps more than anything else at the time, they just didn't like the government taking these decisions, which they felt they should be taking.